December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow on the ground, fog in the trees, and a quiet that had no business being that quiet. 18 men from First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, sat in their foxholes on a frozen ridge above the village of Lanzerath. 4 forward artillery observers from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion had joined them. 22 Americans total. They were green. The 99th Division had barely seen combat. Their foxholes were shallow because the ground was half frozen and nobody had brought enough entrenching tools. They ate cold rations. They stamped their boots against the dirt to keep blood moving in their toes. Below them, the road from Lanzerath ran north. Whoever controlled this ridge controlled that road, and whoever controlled that road controlled the route into the American rear. None of them knew it yet. None of them could have known. But somewhere behind the German lines, an offensive was coiling. The largest the Wehrmacht would ever launch on the Western Front. 3 entire German armies, 200,000 men. The spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army needed that road, needed it on day 1. And standing between that spearhead and its timetable were 22 men on a hill with rifles, a few machine guns, and no idea what was coming. Adolf Hitler had staked everything on one assumption about these men. He believed American soldiers were soft. He remembered Kasserine Pass nearly 2 years earlier, where green American troops had broken and run under German assault. He was certain it would happen again. That assumption would meet its test on this ridge, and the answer would not come from generals or war planners. It would come from cold, tired men in shallow holes, waiting in the fog. For months, Hitler had been planning in secret. The offensive through the Ardennes was his last gamble, a massive armored thrust designed to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The logic was simple. Strike where the Americans were weakest. Strike in terrain they thought impassable for large-scale operations. Strike in winter, when Allied air superiority meant nothing under low cloud cover. And strike fast. Speed was everything. The German timetable demanded that lead elements reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours. There was no margin. Every hour of delay bled fuel the Germans did not have, gave the Allies time they could not be given. SS Lieutenant Colonel Johann Peiper commanded the Spearhead battle group, approximately 4,800 men, tanks, half-tracks, armored vehicles. His column was the tip of the knife. His orders were clear. Drive west, seize bridges, do not stop for anything. But Peiper's route ran through Lanzerath. On the ridge above that village, Bouck's platoon had been in position for days. They had dug in along a tree line overlooking an open field that sloped downhill toward the road. They had established fields of fire. They had strung communication wire back to regiment. The morning of December 16th was fog and silence. Then it wasn't. Artillery opened up before dawn. The ground shook, trees splintered, snow fell from branches in sheets. The barrage rolled across the entire Ardennes front, 85 miles of it. The offensive had achieved complete tactical surprise. Along the ridge, Bouck's men pressed themselves into their foxholes. Dirt and ice rained down. The communication wire went dead almost immediately. They were cut off. Then the shelling stopped. And in the silence that followed, they heard something worse. Voices. Hundreds of voices coming up the hill through the fog. The Germans emerged from the tree line below, columns of them, marching in formation up the snow-covered road toward Lanzerath village. Bouck's men watched from their foxholes, fingers on triggers, breath held. The Germans were close enough to count. These were not ordinary infantry. They were paratroopers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Luftwaffe paratroopers, elite soldiers trained for exactly this kind of assault. Approximately 500 of them were moving toward the ridge. 500 against 22. Bouck had a decision to make. His platoon was an intelligence and reconnaissance unit. Their job was to observe and report, not to hold ground against battalion-strength attacks. Regiment was unreachable. The wire was cut, radio contact sporadic at best. The logical move was to pull back. He looked at the field of fire his men had established, the open slope, the tree line that gave them concealment, the machine gun positions covering the approaches. He told his men to hold. The first German formation moved into the open ground below the ridge. They advanced uphill in the snow, visible against the white slope like dark ink on paper. They did not know the Americans were there. Bouck waited. His men waited. The Germans climbed closer. 200 yards. 150. 100. The order came. Machine guns opened up. Rifles cracked along the tree line. The first wave of German paratroopers went down in the snow. Bodies crumpled on the open slope. The survivors scrambled for cover, but there was almost none. Just white ground and bare winter brush. The Germans pulled back, regrouped in the trees below. And then they came again. This time, they knew where the American positions were. This time, they came with fire and movement, suppressing the foxholes, working up the flanks. And 22 men answered them again. The second assault hit harder. German paratroopers used the folds in the terrain now, crawling forward under covering fire, trying to close the distance where American machine guns could not track them. It did not work. Bouck's men had positioned themselves well. The machine guns swept the approaches. The artillery observers called coordinates into their radio, and when the signal held, which was not often, shells dropped among the German assembly areas below. The paratroopers fell back a second time, left their dead in the snow. A third attack came, then a fourth. Each time the Germans reorganized and pushed up that slope. Each time the 22 Americans on the ridge drove them back. Ammunition belts shortened. Rifle magazines emptied faster than they could be replaced from the limited supply in the foxholes. Hours passed. The fog thinned but never fully lifted. No reinforcements came, no orders came. The wire stayed dead. Bouck's platoon existed in a pocket of noise and smoke on a ridge that the rest of the American army did not yet understand was critical. The German commanders below were furious. Their timetable was bleeding out in the snow on that slope. Every hour pinned down at Lanzerath was an hour Piper's armored column sat idle, burning fuel, waiting for the infantry to clear the way. This was the pivot, not a decision made in a headquarters, not a line drawn on a map. The pivot was 22 men choosing not to leave a hill. Hitler had assumed they would break. Kasserine had told him they would break. Every calculation behind the Ardennes offensive rested on that belief, that American soldiers could not absorb this kind of punishment and hold. The men on Lanzerath Ridge had not read those calculations. They just kept firing. By midday, the snow around the foxholes was black with powder residue. Brass casings littered the frozen ground. The bark on the trees behind the American positions was chewed apart by return fire. The German paratroopers adapted. They stopped coming in waves and started infiltrating. Small teams working through the woods on the flanks, probing for gaps in the thin American line. 22 men cannot cover every approach. The perimeter was too wide for so few rifles. Wounded men kept shooting. There was nowhere to evacuate them, no medics beyond what the platoon carried. A man took a round, pressed snow against the wound, and picked his rifle back up. That was the medical plan. The artillery observers burned through their radio batteries trying to maintain contact with the gun line. When they got through, The shells made a difference, scattering German formations before they could mass for another push. When the radio died, silence filled the gap, and the paratroopers pressed closer. 5 assaults, 6. The Germans kept coming because they had to. The road through Lanzerath was not optional. It was the designated route for the entire spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army. Every minute it stayed blocked was a minute subtracted from Hitler's gamble. The sun moved behind the overcast. Afternoon bled into the ridgeline. Shadows stretched across the slope where German dead lay in the positions where they had fallen hours earlier. Nobody collected them. Nobody could. Bouck's men were running out of everything: ammunition, daylight. The odds that had been terrible at dawn were now something beyond calculation. And still the order to withdraw never came, because there was no one left to give it. They held the ridge, hour after hour, because that was what was in front of them. The last assault came as the light failed. German paratroopers pushed up the slope from 3 directions simultaneously. Muzzle flashes in the tree line below, muzzle flashes from the flanks. The sound collapsed into one continuous roar. Rifles, machine guns, grenades detonating against frozen earth. The American machine guns fired until the barrels glowed in the dusk. Ammunition belts fed through receivers in long, unbroken streams. Then the belts ran out. A foxhole on the left flank went quiet. Then another. Snow, smoke, the smell of cordite so thick it replaced oxygen. Branches falling from shattered trees landing across positions without sound anyone could hear above the gunfire. Bouck's men fired their last magazines. Some switched to pistols. The perimeter contracted, men pulling back to tighter positions, shoulder to shoulder in holes meant for 2, now holding 3. 18 hours. They had held this ridge for 18 hours against 500 elite paratroopers. The snow on the slope below was a record of every failed assault. Dark shapes motionless against white ground, scattered from the tree line to within yards of the American foxholes. Then the ammunition was gone. Not low. Gone. Rifles with empty chambers, machine guns with nothing to feed, men gripping weapons that had become dead weight. The Germans closed the final distance. Figures moving through the smoke, voices shouting in German, hands pulling men from foxholes. Bouck's platoon was overrun. The survivors were taken prisoner. The ridge fell silent. But the road through Lanzerath had been closed for an entire day, and that day could not be given back. Piper's armored column finally pushed through Lanzerath, 36 hours behind schedule. 36 hours that were supposed to deliver him to the Meuse River bridges. He never reached them. Those lost hours cascaded through the German timetable like cracks through ice. Every unit waiting behind Piper stacked up. Fuel consumption mounted while columns sat idle. The element of surprise, the single advantage Hitler's offensive possessed, bled away with every passing hour. American reinforcements that should never have arrived in time began reaching threatened sectors. Units repositioned, defensive lines hardened. The window that the Ardennes offensive needed to exploit slammed shut, 1 hour at a time. Piper's battle group of 4,800 men, the spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army, reached the small town of Stavelot after those 36 frustrating hours. By then, the Americans had organized. By then, the bridges Piper needed were contested. By then, the offensive was already dying, though it would take weeks of brutal fighting before the last German units withdrew. Hitler's assumption had been tested and broken on a frozen ridge by men he had dismissed as soft. The transformation was complete. Whatever the American army had been at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, disorganized, poorly led, unprepared, it was no longer that army. The men at Lanzerath Ridge were proof written in 18 hours of sustained combat against 5-to-1 odds. 22 soldiers had not won the Battle of the Bulge. No single action could claim that. But they had jammed the gears of the German machine at the moment it needed to run flawlessly. And gears, once jammed, do not simply restart. The question Hitler never asked was simple. What if they hold? Every plan for the Ardennes offensive assumed rapid collapse of American forward positions. The timetables were built on it. The fuel allocations depended on it. The entire operational concept required American soldiers to do what they had done at Kasserine: panic, scatter, run. No contingency existed for 22 men who refused to leave a hill. This was the flaw at the center of the gamble. Not logistics, though the logistics were desperate. Not weather, though the weather turned against Germany when the skies cleared and Allied aircraft returned. The flaw was a judgment about human beings made by a man who understood nothing about what those human beings had become. 2 years of war had changed the American soldier. Training had improved. Leadership had hardened. Men who survived North Africa, Sicily, Italy, they carried lessons in their bones that no intelligence briefing could capture. And even green troops like Bouck's platoon, men who had never faced combat before December 16th, fought with a discipline that shattered German assumptions on first contact. The responsibility for this miscalculation belonged to one man. The same man who had ordered the offensive, overruled his general's objections, and staked Germany's remaining reserves on a belief that had expired 2 years earlier. Hitler bet everything on the memory of Kasserine. Lanzerath Ridge was the answer. Not from a general, not from a strategy. From 18 men and 4 observers in frozen foxholes who simply did not break. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and change the course of the war instead consumed Germany's last operational reserves and accelerated the collapse it was designed to prevent. For decades, almost nobody talked about Lanzerath Ridge. The Battle of the Bulge produced larger engagements, more famous stands, names that entered the national memory. 22 men on an unnamed ridge did not make headlines. But the record was there, in after-action reports, in prisoner interrogations, in the gap on the German timetable that no staff officer could explain away. Years later, the platoon received official recognition, the most decorated American unit of its size for a single engagement in the entire war. Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star. The medals came late, as they often do for small units in large wars. What the medals marked was not complicated. 22 men held a position for 18 hours against approximately 500 elite paratroopers. They disrupted the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army. They bought time that could not be purchased any other way. The Ardennes offensive failed for many reasons, but its failure began on a ridge above a small Belgian village, in shallow foxholes dug into half-frozen ground, where a handful of soldiers answered Hitler's final gamble with the only thing they had. They stayed. And that was enough.